Good morning. Thank you very much to Ian for inviting me to speak, and Roz too for supporting the process for this morning. I'm really pleased to meet you all and to speak to you. So, as Ian said, I'm Group Chief Executive of an organisation which from this week becomes publicly known as Education Support Partnership, registered charity, formerly known as three organisations: Teacher Support Network, REAK, which traditionally worked with teachers, Recourse, a charity that worked in FE and HE, all staff in FE and HE, and a third organisation called Work Life Support, which was a commercial organisation working in schools. And we brought these three organisations together through internal mergers and actually created a single brand. And from next week, our website goes live next Monday, and then there'll be a launch event, there's a parliamentary event, and around the country events. What do? We work in education, we work with staff basically, all staff working in education with the new charity, with new articles. That basically means we provide them with coaching, counselling and support. We have a number of free services, so about 40,000 people a year use our telephone helpline. It's 24/7, 365 days a year, and all the people that are calling are generally calling about a personal or professional crisis in some way, shape or form. So to give you an example, a teacher might phone up and say, I'm a newly qualified teacher, I hate it. I hate my mentor, I don't know what to do. You might get somebody phone up and say, I am having conflict with my colleagues on the leadership team. There's a whole range of stuff, from behavioural issues for children, right through to crises like I've got a partner who's ill or I'm getting divorced. And what we do is we provide support on the helpline. Our packages into school are largely more complicated because we're working with head teachers on leadership development, we're working with staff engagement, doing surveys of the temperature and culture inside an organisation, and we provide employee assistance programs, so face-to-face counselling, whereas the free services are basically on the telephone. So it's quite an interesting organisation. 950 schools and education establishments use us. We have a turnover of about 6.5, nearly 7 million. When I arrived in 2009, I was appointed, having been working in Peterborough for quite a large community charity, which we then went through a merger. And I spent my final year of 8 years, very happy years there, having decided that I didn't want to compete to be chief executive of the new organisation with my colleague who was chief executive of the YMCA in Cambridge, because A, we both got on very well, and B, I thought I wanted to move on. And we'd agreed that I would spend sort of nearly the final year, turned out to be about 10 months, actually looking around for what I wanted to do next. So that was kind of the plan. And that was the first time I'd had that kind of intelligent conversation about how do you plan your exit and what are you going to do. My kids were of a certain age where I thought, actually I'd like to go back into London. And I wanted to change sector. My wife had worked in teaching, she was also a psychotherapist. I had been teaching myself a little bit and done lots of things in my career, civil service, local government, charities, the theatre, so quite a lot of stuff. I've been on a lot of boards, some here in London. I was a founder of Stratford Circus, some of you might know, the Arts Centre next to the Theatre Royal. I was one of the founder directors of that. Came out of an idea we had on a piece of paper over fact packing, basically, in the days when I was smoking, about building a new arts centre for what is now the highest funded arts centre. When we started, it was a nightmare. We hung on to money and funding, it was really difficult. But we recruited chief executives and teams and so on. So I've got quite a wide-ranging experience. And I was very keen to get into education. It was either social service type organisations that I was interested in, social issues, or education that really appealed to me, or mental health. And the education charity I went to, I got offered 2 jobs in the same week. It was the first time it's ever happened to me. I was so excited. And eventually I chose this one. And when I arrived, as you do, you think to yourself, I'm going to find out the landscape in my first 100 days, and what am I going to do? And the chair spent time briefing me. Delightful chair I had. And he said to me, I think there's a few problems in the staff team. And the board are very keen that you explore that when you get here. And your predecessor has taken on the role of in one of our subsidiary organisations. And okay, fine, that's interesting. Came in. I did indeed find issues within the staff. I met everybody. And clearly within the staff team there was a lot of problems because basically everyone had been left with a chief operating officer who was very close to the chief executive, but there was very little trust between anybody really, and people were doing their own thing in silos. That was easier to manage at the beginning because you come in, you're new, you start to create stuff. So we started to kind of unpick that, but it became clear to me that the conflicts of interest in the organisation between staff were quite complex. And as I started to meet and get to know the board and the stakeholders, I also recognised the structure of governance was so complicated. We had 11 organisations basically, with separate boards, had about 5 separate boards, advisory groups that were national, and I spent a lot of my first few months actually travelling around the country doing board meetings and trying to understand what they thought they were doing and what I thought they were going to be doing for the future. And what became clear to me was I had to start somewhere. And I actually, interestingly, started to work with the Chief Operating Officer and realised that she and I, although we got on personally, she knew that the time had come to kind of move on, really, because she could see that I was going to make some changes. And that was my first experience of an interim. I brought in an interim finance director. And that worked very well. I just recruited that really out of the general market. And that was my first experience of that. Then I got into the governance side, and basically what I started to see was the trustees had correctly identified problems with the staff team, but they'd done nothing about looking at the issues that they needed to face in terms of what were we going to do. When the first budget round came a few months later, I was slightly horrified to see people presenting me with a deficit budget that amounted to a total of nearly £600,000, and people thinking they could go to reserves, which were reasonably healthy, and actually just underwrite this kind of huge loss. So I was quite staggered and thought, actually, we can't do this. And the board suddenly realised that they weren't in control, actually. They had a sort of plan, but they really didn't understand between them what they were going to do. And a bigger issue was that many of the stakeholders were trade unions. And one trade union, the founder trade union in particular, was absolutely adamant that this organisation was a subsection of its own organisation. So they felt really they had the majority of the people on the board, and basically people's interests were largely in protecting the interests of their union rather than actually working together for the good of the charity and putting that hat aside. So I realised it was going to be quite tricky to make some changes, and I decided in the end to bring in some consultants that I had worked with previously, just to do a bit of scoping work with me around how to tackle the board, because I recognised that they were my employers. And actually, it felt very much as though, although the chair got it, he was going to have a real struggle on his hands persuading other people that change was in the air and it would be good. So what we did initially was we brought back in various subsidiaries, and we took out various subsidiaries out of the group mix. Some of them were commercially based, and some of the staff had shareholdings, and former staff had shareholdings, but the charity had sort of the majority of shares. We were able to buy them back, if you like. That was quite complex. And in doing that, I actually appointed a non-executive director to one of them, who was actually very commercially savvy. I met him by accident, and it was my first attempt at a kind of appointment to a board of a non-exec, because I'd been asked by the board to sit on this subsidiary. I decided the conflicts of interest would be huge. I needed someone who had strong commercial skills at a board level, and it was a guy who worked with James Dyson, and who was quite a character in his own right. So he was used to different kinds of personalities, and he was used to dealing with that kind of high-level commercial issue. He went on, he gave great value to the board, and also helped to smooth out this difficult relationship. We started to save money, we started to kind of do all the things you would do to get the organisation back in balance. So my term for that was business as usual, and also governance change. And really, over the period of 2.5 years, it was a question of putting together options for the board that they might buy into. And I used the consultants at that point largely to help me identify with the board exactly the issues that they needed to face, so that I could participate in those conversations without having to actually front them up. And that worked very well indeed. At that point it became clear that we needed some new people on the main charity board. And that's when I first met Ian and Emma, and I was introduced by the late Stephen Lloyd to you, and then met Emma, of course, and you helped us recruit 2 people. One who was working in stores at BT, and we needed somebody who was very commercially able at contracts, really, who had a lot of contracts, outsourced service contracts, and that needed a lot of work on it. I thought we were overpaying for outsourced services, and indeed I knew we were, but I needed somebody who could help me persuade the board that actually we needed to make changes about suppliers, because they were biggish contracts. And then I brought, there was another person who was in marketing, because it was clear to me that the organisation is very niche, and although we're reasonably well known in the education sector, we really needed to do more to be better known in order to elicit donations and actually members and so on and so forth. Those 2 people are still with us, and they made a big difference because it started to make the board think about their relationships with each other and how they were going to behave with each other, because it was very much like running a trade union meeting. I'm a trade unionist at heart, so if anyone's thinking I'm being anti-trade union, I'm not. But it has a particular style and culture, the trade union movement, and it's very much about motions and how you second a motion,